So what I'm going to try to do today is, is to talk about the research I do in Africa and what it is like also to study human evolution in Africa. So, in a way, everybody's interested in human...
I can't hear upstairs.
Oh, I'm very sorry. I'll have to try not to move. Okay, so we're all interested in human evolution, and we're all interested in our origins, and you know who we are, why we're different from each other, and so on. And thank you very much. And what we have actually is more than a century of both discoveries and questions regarding the role of Africa in human evolution. So I put in here these pictures that I showed are just Richard and his family, which for everybody interested in the field, it's always the starting point. So we know an immense amount about the origins of our lineage in Africa. We know an extraordinary amount about the evolution, the diversity, the number of species, what they did, when humans made the first stone tools, which now we know it's over 3 million years ago, an enormous amount. And a lot of that information and a lot of that story all happens in Africa. We also know something critical, which is the part of the story in which I work, which actually, as a species, we are very, very recent. Although in the previous slide, this is millions of years on the left. All those are all the species that make our story. We are right there at the end. Sorry, this is turning on and off. Okay. It's not working. Okay. So, what is important to realize that as a species, we are actually extraordinarily recent. We have a story, a history, that is about 200,000 years old. I know that sounds a lot. In evolutionary terms, it's nothing. And we also know that our origins were in Africa as a whole species. We know that our closest relatives were the Neanderthals. We know we probably had something to do with the fact that there are no Neanderthals today. We know that although we're 7 billion people, Africans, which are a portion of that number, they have an order of magnitude more diversity than the rest of the world put together. So we know a number of things that are critical for trying to understand our origins. We also know that that story began probably in East Africa. So in this graph, forget the graph, it's a complex graph. What I put was the main lineages we're aware that existed in our evolution and key fossils that come...
Fine. Very good.
But it turns off. Okay. And key fossils that are particular features that shape our understanding. And one in particular, there are two fossils that were found in Ethiopia, or southern Ethiopia, the northern edge of the Turkana basin, that point the moment when modern human morphology, the modern human anatomy, our brain, our size, our shape, first appears in the record. We also have now a very rich record of human genetic diversity. And what that shows is that in this immense range of lineages, this is any one gene, Africans not only are at the root of that diversity, but they actually have lineages that probably split from others in whole populations over 100,000 years old. Which means also that there are some Africans that are more closely related to me than they are to other Africans. So it's a very complex history and a very complex pattern to the structure of that history. So we also know that the rest of the world, everybody that is not African in origin, they're a subset of the world's diversity. So we have all this information, extraordinarily rich, fossils, lineages, periods, genes, and yet it's not quite enough. So why isn't it enough? These amazing fossils that we all quote, it is the source of our knowledge that the fact that modern humans evolved probably in Eastern Africa 200,000 years ago. But that's all we have, is 2 sites in Ethiopia. And yet, Africa is huge. And for most of this continent, we have no information. So I set up a project which was called In Africa to counter the current focus of attention on out of Africa. The moment that modern humans dispersed out of Africa, left the continent and colonized the world. And my point is, well, surely first we have to know what happened in Africa, what shaped the origins, what selective pressures led for there to be a modern person. How do we know how we are different if we have nothing to compare them with? What happened those 150,000 years of our own species history that we stayed in that continent? And what's more, what happened to all the people who never left Africa? So those questions at the moment are not at the top of research agendas, which remain out of Africa, dispersals, colonization of the world. So this project is working at several places, but the bulk of the work is happening in Lake Turkana, which you can see here in the map. So you should have, well, I just told you Africa is huge, we could work anywhere, so why Lake Turkana? Well, there are 2 reasons. One, because we know it's rich, we know it's fossiliferous, we know there is an amazing prehistory and fossil record in Turkana, and yet there were no fossils of the age we're interested in, except the ones that Richard found 1967 in the northern edge of the basin. So there was a risk that we may not be able to find sediments and fossils of this age. But I was prepared to take that risk, partly because I thought there is one other fossil that we don't have the context for, and it must be of that age, so I think that we will find them. The other reason was because around that area of Turkana, there's a group of people who live there. They're called the Turkana tribe, and they have an extraordinarily interesting history. And also there was a study in the early 90s that said they're unusually diverse, and nobody had ever studied them again. So we set out to put in a project, most of which is looking at fossils, excavations, doing what we call the paleo work, and part of which is actually working with the Turkana. I see here in the audience there's Joe, who's part of this project, and a Kenyan student, a Kenyan PhD student, funded by the Cambridge Trust, who is doing the genetics. And they have been collecting information on genotype and phenotype across Turkana, hundreds and hundreds of people, and now we're extending it across Kenya. So let me tell you very briefly some of the things we found, and then why I think it matters. So first, in terms of what we call the paleo world. So we have found hundreds of localities. Those localities can be tiny, or they can be vast. But we have, at the end, in what in terms of prehistory or anthropology we call sites, proper sites, we have dozens. And what this is important is because, in a way, they were always there. And people have been working around this basin now for 45 years. And they were always there. But nobody was asking the right questions about this period. Partly because there has been so remarkable little interest about the African side of the modern human evolutionary history. People like to find Australopithecines, they like to find the early stone tools, they like to find the first Homo, but modern humans, hey, we can go to France and study them too. So what have we found? Among the things that we have found there, we have a series of sites, the data period that we call the Middle-Pleistocene. These sites are dated between 200 and 300,000 years old. In them, we have the puzzling finding of hominins that are different from each other. So we have a new early modern human, which hopefully we'll publish next year, but we also have another hominin that is not modern human in morphology. And as far as we can tell, they're probably the same age. So this will take a lot of disentangling and understanding, a moment in which modern humans may have shared that space with other hominins. We have also found, this is more of curiosity, this is my colleague Federica, who's also here, a landscape of footprints, of ancient human footprints, which is fascinating. We have also found a lot of evidence about early human behavior, what they chose to hunt, how they hunted, how they constructed their tools, when they started fishing, and so on. And all this is important for us to build a sense of how humans were using the environment in the past. And also, this is what the area we work, what it looks like. And you may see in the picture of that landscape the white stripes. So those white stripes are actually shells. And these shells mark when it was a beach. Because with climate change, but these we're talking geological climate change, the levels of the lake have gone up and down over to an extraordinary extent. So what we have been able to do is reconstruct in detail the environmental change and the lake levels as they shifted 1,000 years per 1,000 years per 1,000 years, and how humans responded to that change in climate. We have also, on a much, much more recent scale, dated to about 10,000 years old, found a landscape, we call it a paleo-landscape of humans, associated with that lake that was going up and down in what we call the African human period, that was dominated by people fishing and hunting and interacting with a range of fauna that we didn't expect. We also found things we didn't expect at all. So in a way, everything I've shown you before was what I was hoping to find, with little touches of novelty. And then we found things that were not in our expectations at all. So among those was the discovery of a massacre. Bit strange to excavate a site where every skeleton had lesions, where the bodies were in strange positions, where there was a pregnant woman, where we had individuals still with the arrowhead tips in their heads. And what this was most surprising, perhaps, so the site is dated to about 10,000 years ago as well. And these were hunter-gatherers. And when we first started discussing, writing up the site and saying, well, there was a case here, these people were attacked 10,000 years ago. And the response from the majority, actually, of our discipline was it can't be. Because you cannot have intergroup violence among hunter-gatherers. they didn't own anything. So if you don't own land, and if you don't have a house, and if you don't have material culture, why would they attack each other? So it can't be. Hunter-gatherers had no war. And yet, here we have a site where people were killed. So there was something these people had that was of sufficient value for you to attack and risk dying in an attack. And for me, that whole discussion that followed about no, hunter-gatherers cannot have war because they don't own property. I said, well, aren't we transporting completely our concepts of value into the past? So that was unexpected, and it was a very interesting discussion. Also unexpected was finding a range of extinct animals that survived, many of which until 10,000 years ago. So we went expecting to find a lot of fauna at the edge of the lake, but not expecting to find so many extinct species. And finally, from the genetics, we found too much diversity. So much diversity that we can't quite explain it. And I'll come back to that. So why does all this matter? It matters because it helps us understand our own species, our behavior, our origins, how we interacted among us and others, like the Neanderthals pictured here. But you know, in any of these interactions, it doesn't matter if you are a Neanderthal or you are just from another country. The measure is the concept of otherness. Is us versus others and how those interactions happen through time. It also matters, and I put another picture of Richard here, burning ivory. It matters because it helps us understand how we interacted and impacted on the environment throughout the thousands of years we've existed. So this is a map of, it's a separate study by another group, and they're looking at the impact of humans as measured by megafauna extinctions. And if you look at Africa, so in red is the date when they assume modern humans are fully present, and you have almost no information, and actually it's all colored in brown, you cannot quite see it in this light, that says insufficient data. So we don't really know when humans began having a major impact on their own environment and animals. It also matters because we have to understand the structure of human diversity. And I pick on here on an article that was published 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago in Nature. It was actually a comment in Nature. And what they're pointing out is that in 2009, 96% of all studies on genetics and genomics were done on Europeans. In 2016, the percentages have shifted a little bit, and yet, as you can see from that graph, is not very much at all. And actually, the study of small populations, of rare indigenous populations, has actually decreased. So this matters because those populations are the ones that have the rare variants that we need to understand to follow the evolution of disease and the evolution of different susceptibilities. And in Africa in particular, where we have a filtered history for genetic diversity, it is critical that we study it in more greater depth. Finally, it matters because development, as well as impacting on wildlife, like Richard has already talked, it impacts on heritage. And the level of destruction of sites and history throughout Africa is enormous. I want to end by pointing out that all this is possible because institutions exist in some places, but it's only in some places. We are very, very lucky and very fortunate that Richard and Lawrence, who's sitting here, he's the director of the Turkana Basin Institute, have created this space. So this space allows us to work, to keep our material, to set up scanners, to do fancy technological things and so on, which is not something easy to do elsewhere. It also allows us to work closely with African colleagues, train them, teach them, local Turkana who work with us. And again, without infrastructure, we couldn't do that. It also has a fantastic field school program that exposes our work and our material to students around the world who all become aware of what we're doing and what is there. So building institutions is critical, but without them, it would be very difficult to go work and do what we do in other places. So, for all the young people, especially all the African young people, if you want to take on the challenge of filling that huge continent with knowledge, I say, ask an important question, but one that can be answered. But do take risks and contribute. Thank you very much.